Welcome, Tim Brookes
Hello.
of the Endangered Alphabets project. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself. Maybe the topic would be an interesting idea. What is this about? Endangered Alphabets.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to come on the program and talk to your audience. Yes, I'm going to explain Endangered Alphabets project by telling the story of how it began. So about 12 years ago, Christmas was coming along, and as usual, I had no money. And I grew up in England, very poor, and so we would make Christmas presents rather than buy them. And so I thought, I'll make Christmas presents. My wife at the time had said she wanted a sign to go outside her office. She was a therapist. So I thought I would try making her or carving her a sign in wood that had her name and, her credentials. And when I started working on this, my older daughter, who was a senior at the Rhode Island School of Design and who was very business minded, said, "Oh, can you make me a sign as well? Because I have an exhibition or show coming up. All of the seniors exhibit their works and put them on for sale. And I want my table to stand out from everybody else's. So can you make me a sign for my table?" And then my younger daughter, who had no reason whatsoever to need a sign, said she wanted a sign as well. She wanted one that said, "Mary Brookes, Fine and Performing Arts." And so I started working on these, and I was teaching myself to carve as I was going. And then I realized that one of my sisters in England needed a sign, and my brother-in-law in England needed a sign. So it was like, that was it. And so I had bought a long piece of wood, and I kept sawing pieces off it and carving these signs, and that was Christmas.
To my surprise. So we have a lot of signs now, but not yet endangered ones.
Exactly. So you have to realize that when people say, how does genius come about? It's always indirectly and by mistake. So the second phase of genius coming about was that I had really enjoyed doing all of these carvings. And after Christmas, I literally had a hole in the wall of our living room that I had cut to put a sound system in, and it didn't work. And I thought, how am I going to fill this hole? And I thought, I'll do another carving. But the hole was vertical, right? The carvings I had been doing were horizontal. The hole was vertical, and I thought, Chinese is vertical script. And so I carved the characters for House of Music and Art, because my then wife and I are both musicians. My daughters were both artists. So I carved this and, shoved it in the hole, and it looked sort of intentional. And then so I went through a phase of asking everybody I knew to choose a Chinese character that represented them in some way. So I carved, a whole bunch of pieces of wood with Chinese characters in them. And then I ran out of that piece of wood, and I ran out of people to carve Chinese characters for. And I thought, okay, I need a new alphabet. And I had been on assignment for National Geographic in southern India a few years previously, and I had seen the Malayalam alphabet, which is really interesting and completely different to Western alphabets. And so I thought, maybe I'll carve something in that. And so I just Googled Malayalam, and I found the website omniglot.com. And this is a compendium of the world's writing systems, or at least at the time, some of them. And I thought this was fascinating for several reasons. One, I'd never heard of most of them. I'm a fairly well-traveled person, but I'd never heard of most of them. Two, I was struck by the fact that time and again, in describing these writing systems, the text said, no longer taught in schools, no longer used for official purposes, only used by priests, only used by women to write secret love letters.
Ooh.
Yes, exactly. And the third thing was that the text that was used to illustrate these scripts, or most of them, was Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says, roughly speaking, all peoples are created alike in dignity and respect. They were endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And I thought, this is very ironic because this is a very noble sentiment. But many of these alphabets or writing systems are endangered because people don't behave toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And I thought, I'll carve a few of these. I'll carve Article 1 in a few of these scripts, and I'll exhibit them as a way of drawing attention to this issue. Because I'd heard of endangered languages, but I had never heard of endangered alphabets. And in fact, I coined the phrase endangered alphabets, thinking that out there were people who were studying this and who knew all about it. And it turned out not to be true. And for better or worse, I, who had no background in linguistics or anthropology or art or woodwork, actually, was left being the person who was kind of taking this on as an issue.
So, and then what? I mean, first of all, you're talking about alphabets, but it's more than that, isn't it?
Yes.
You use the word alphabet for writing system, but an alphabet is a specific form of a writing system.
Yes.
So you went into that, and you have a whole list of different writing systems on your website or blog.
Yes. So the fact that I didn't know and had never heard of abjads and syllabaries and abagidas when I started this is just one sign of how, the fact that the wrong idiot was in charge of this project. But it was a convenient shorthand, but it did mean that to anybody who actually knew what they were talking about, I would have to clarify and amplify, the definition. What I was really fascinated by at first, because I didn't have a background in linguistics and therefore I didn't ask questions about structure, for example, whatever, I was looking at them from the point of view of somebody who was carving them. And so I was asking questions about graphics. I was asking questions like, why does the Baybayin script of the Philippines, why is it so thin? Why is the Canadian Aboriginal syllabics script used for First Nations languages in Canada? Why is it so mathematical? And so in asking those questions, I found that I was going into areas that classically trained linguists don't ask.
And did you find any answers to those questions?
Oh, absolutely. So, for example, the Baybayin script was so thin because it was incised in bamboo with the point of a knife. And so that made it very, very hard to carve and even harder to paint because I'm using my narrowest gouge to cut the wood. Apparently what they would do is, having incised the letters with the point of a knife, they would then reach into the ashes of the fire and they would take a handful of ash and rub it up and down the bamboo, and that would stick in the incised cuts and make it stand out more.
That's like we use ink, but a different way of doing it. We apply ink, and then they just first make some kind of incision, and then they rub the color in it.
And so what I began to ask myself, because originally I hadn't intended to make this a subject that I researched or wrote about, but because my background is as a writer, whenever I undertake some kind of new project, I always start keeping a journal specifically about that project. And so I started looking into these issues and asking these questions. And quite quickly, it became clear that what was really kind of originally just a kind of conservation project quite quickly became a human rights and social justice project. And I can tell you the story about the one absolutely key thing that change the direction of the Endangered Alphabets completely, if you're interested.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I did the first exhibition, which was 13 carvings, and it took me nearly a year and a half to do them. It nearly killed me. But I was so interested that I began just sort of reaching out to try and find other writing systems that were endangered, or they were minority, or they were indigenous or marginalized scripts. And as it happened, I was going to go out to Bangladesh to do a public health project wearing another of my hats. And so I thought, before I go, I'll put the word out on social media to try and find out if there are any endangered writing systems in Bangladesh. And someone got in touch with me and said, yes, absolutely, and gave me some names. And while I was in Dhaka, I was fortunate enough to meet people from 3 different indigenous marginalized groups living in the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh. And they told me about the way in which their cultures had been systematically marginalized by the government, which had a one language policy. Unless you spoke the national language, Bangla, you were not eligible for full citizenship status. Not only that, but their whole area was under military control and was so highly fenced off that I couldn't go there as a foreigner. I was not allowed there. So anyway, one of these people gave me the piece of text to carve, and I came back to the United States and I carved it, and I put a photograph of it up on the website. And about 6 months later, I got an email from someone saying, I cannot believe it. Here I am on the other side of the world from where I grew up, and I see my language. If you are, and he explained that he was from the hill tracts. He was the first of his people to be educated in the United States. And he said, he was doing a graduate degree in teaching at Harvard. And he said, if you're ever in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I would love to meet you. And as it happened, I was going to be in Cambridge the following week. And we met up, and he told me the story. His name is Mong Nu. And he told me the story of his first day at school. So when he was 6, his parents sent him to school. His parents are very keen on education, and they want their children brought up properly. So he walks off to school and sits down in the classroom, and the teacher starts talking in a language he doesn't understand. And he is, he's a well-intentioned little kid, but sooner or later, he's just baffled, and he's staring out the window, and the teacher catches him not paying attention and calls him up to the front of the class and canes him, and then sends him back to his seat. And then a little while later, the same thing happens again. The teacher calls him up, canes him on his hand again. And so he goes home, and the following morning, he's just sitting there, and his mother says, it's time for you to leave for school. And he's just sitting there with tears running down his face. And he says, I don't want to go to school. And his mother says, you must go to school, And he explains what happened. And his mother essentially then homeschooled him, which is extremely hard under circumstances where you have very, very few resources. And you're living in, a mountain village, essentially, without motorized contact with the outside world, without electricity. So he does so well that he winds up getting a scholarship to a boarding school across the country, and then winds up going to the University of Hawaii, first of all, to a degree in engineering, etc. So he told me what it was like to be on the other side. And that changed everything, because it's sort of like, if you know of an endangered species, like the spotted owl, and you say, oh, there's only 12 spotted owls left, it could become extinct, then you kind of go, oh, well, that would be a shame, right? To us, it's a shame. To the spotted owl, it is the worst possible catastrophe. And I realized then that the idea of simply showing these minority scripts and talking about them was not enough. Even though the traditions in linguistics and anthropology are you report, you don't get involved, I decided that I needed to get involved. And that was the beginning of a multi-year collaboration with teachers and pupils in indigenous mother language schools in Bangladesh, which really, as I say, changed the direction of everything I was doing.
And did you get any results from your involvement? Is there more education in the native languages of those people now?
So several things have happened over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. One of them is that by raising this as an issue in every manner that I could and that they could, the government has now officially said, okay, we're going to make resources available in mother tongue languages. But of course, they don't have anybody who can teach in those languages. And the resources that, you know, the books that they say they're publishing are not being distributed to the schools. You know, it's a huge challenge. The second thing is that we started creating educational materials for the schools. Initially, it was just one school that Hmong had helped to start in an abandoned temple that had been burned down by the military. And there were kids who were hanging around the temple because either they'd lost their parents or their parents couldn't afford to keep them. And because the temple monk would collect donations, you know, food, rice, small amounts of money from the, you know, the people around him, he would use that to, you know, to feed the kids. So that got converted into a school, but there were no teaching materials in these kids' writing systems. So, for example, one of the indigenous minority groups in Bangladesh is the Chakma people. The Chakma people have a long and distinguished history of almost aristocratic position as a people, and certainly very educated, very self-governing. So because the Chakma alphabet, the Chakma script is not taught, I met a guy who was actually in a very significant position in the capital, Dhaka, who was Chakma, who could not read and write Chakma because the army had come into his village and had burned down his house, which had the largest collection of books and manuscripts in the Chakma script and language. And so he grew up never seeing his own writing system. So with some of my students, we did a whole bunch of really interesting things. We created alphabet wall charts. We made up rubber stamps so the kids could like stamp their letters out. We made the first coloring book that the kids had ever seen, because art is rarely taught as a subject in the developing world. We created writing journals so that the kids could write about their lives and their days, etc., which, again, typically is way more student-centric than you would see. And then Hmong and the teachers started doing this project where they would have the kids go home and ask their grandparents or village elders to tell them a story that they heard when they were young. The kids then came back to the classroom and would tell the story, often with great elaborations and great drama, to the class. And it would be recorded, which, interestingly enough, in itself was a dangerous act. So Hmong was once arrested simply for having a video recorder on him, because they assumed, therefore, he was a journalist who was going into the hill tracts to report on what was going on there. So the videotape would then be transcribed and sent to us, and we would have the story typeset, and we would have the English version side by side. We would get illustrators to illustrate these books. And they became the first books or children's storybooks that these kids had ever seen. And of course, they were not only in their own language and their own script, but they featured their own narratives, their own folktales, their own images that they were familiar to them from around the village and from their culture. So it was a sort of a cultural validation in a situation where, as I'm sure you know, when a culture gets marginalized, they're encouraged to believe they are inferior or they're worthless. And all that they can aspire to do is to be poor copies of the dominant culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I teach Dutch to adults who come here in Belgium. Mm-hmm. And I have often had people from Morocco in my class, and then I ask about the languages they speak, and they forget to mention Berber. Yes, because they don't even consider it a language, or they think it's some kind of inferior dialect of Arabic, which it's not, of course. It's not even a language. And they often even don't know that there is a script in their language, although it has been officially recognized now in Morocco, hasn't it?
Yes, it was recognized in the 1990s, but it's taken a long time for it actually to make public appearance. So I was in Morocco 2 years ago, and in many places, typically associated with schools or with government institutions, you would see the text outside in French in the Latin alphabet, and in Arabic in the Arabic script, and then also in the Amazigh languages.
Yes. Yeah. So that's starting to move now. It's not endangered anymore. Huh?
You can never tell because, for example, in Algeria next door, there are still a variety of ways in which the Amazigh people are, let us say, discouraged from developing their Amazigh identity and language. So it's still it's what comes of being part of a culture that does not have its own nation. So because the Amazigh people were once, all the way from the Canary Islands to, the western borders of Egypt, but they never had their own country, it means that in all of those countries of North Africa, someone else came in and wrote the rules.
Mm-hmm.
As a side note, for those who are listening, while you are talking about these different places that you've been, I'm checking now the map on endangeredalphabets.net, and you can actually go and visit those places. I just went to, I was curious, and I went to Bangladesh to see what was on the site, and you can actually go and see what was the name of the tribe that you mentioned several tribes?
Okay, so yes, there are several. There's Chakma.
The Chakma,
Marma, there's Mro.
Yeah.
And then further north, there's Silati Nagri up in the northeast of Bangladesh. But yes, so until when I started this project only 12 years ago, the government of Bangladesh was denying there were any indigenous peoples in Bangladesh.
Yes, the same goes for, I went a lot to Niger, and they said there are no indigenous peoples here because everybody came later. Nobody is originally from here. There are different ethnicities here, but nobody was first. So that's how they signed the UN Treaty on Indigenous Peoples, the rights of indigenous peoples, but they said there's no problem here because we don't have any indigenous peoples.
Right.
That's also a way of handling it, of course.
And exactly the same thing happened in the state of Vermont, where I have lived for pretty much all the time I've been in the US, because, and this has something to do with writing, in fact, because the Abnaki are indigenous to this area, but because there are no written records that establish their history and their primacy, and because they were largely a semi-nomadic people who didn't build structures that could be identified, 1,000 years later as evidence, both of these things were taken by the government of the state to say there are no indigenous people, therefore we don't need to grant anybody, hunting rights or protect their burial grounds or set aside funds for teaching their history or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
All that has changed, by the way, just in the last couple of years. And that's actually part of a huge very positive worldwide movement that's been taking place that I've seen happening over the last 10 years and increasingly over the last 5 years, that you're getting a resurgence in the interest in and the value of and respect for minority cultures and indigenous cultures. Obviously, there's a huge way to go, but that wasn't there 10 years ago.
I have noticed similar things with language movements in general. In Europe, there are several, but they have a bit of a different situation than, let's say, in Bangladesh. But it seems to be indeed a general trend all over the world, indigenous languages, minority languages. And I was thinking, looking at your site now and seeing the map and all the resources that we have online, if social media and the internet plays, what role does it play in building these new movements? Because for example, writing systems, those are visual things. So it seems to me that the internet is the perfect way to preserve writing systems, to talk about them, to bring people together, to discuss and to share.
Yes, on the other hand, I think the internet has a very unifying influence. So it's a bit both ways, isn't it?
It is in a way, but there is also I've seen this happening with language movements in Europe. All the minority languages, they found their way to the internet, and they are building a new base to attract younger generations. And you see these movements are small, but they are very flourishing. They have a new younger culture. They produce music, they make videos, they translate software. They are very active, and that brings the younger generations in. So
you just need one person who takes the initiative and is dynamic enough to.
Often that is the case. Someone I know for someone who started Wikipedia in I think it was Galician or Asturian, and he pretty much reignited a language movement in that way. And sometimes it's just a few pioneers that have to start something, and they attract new people, and we kick off a new.
What is your view on the influence of the internet? Good, bad, both?
So you have beautifully illustrated something that I say, which is the internet always acts in two opposite ways simultaneously. So especially, let's say, in the early days of the internet, 1990s and the 2000s, then the internet was undoubtedly a force of cultural and linguistic hegemony, because not only were the dominant world languages dominant in the internet, but even just coding. The coding of the internet is done in the Latin alphabet, right? So
it is.
At the heart of all of it is this sense that, the Latin alphabet is the world's tool. But increasingly, then what you say is exactly true. I know of groups, let's say in India, where one person is teaching a script through a Facebook group to, say, 12 people, and that is the revival movement. Also, what's happening at the same time is people are creating new custom indigenous scripts for cultures that either didn't have their own script or had a script that has been lapsed or forced out of existence for a long period of time. And
yes, we did a special about Fulfulde once.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are some guys who made a script specifically for that language.
Yes, this is the Barry brothers.
Yes,
I know that's the Abla script.
Yes.
So there are a lot of people. I actually have, I'm in the process of putting together a spreadsheet of all of the world's writing systems that were identifiably created by one person. And there are way more than you think. There's more than 100.
So there are not only scripts that are vanishing, but there are also new scripts coming up.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So in a sense, the reason I put both of them under my umbrella is because whether they are sort of endangered and waning or being traditional scripts that are being under threat, or new scripts that are emerging, in many ways, they face exactly the same dangers. They face the sense that some other culture's script is more important. And in particular, is more important on a regional, national, or global basis. And you have a very interesting situation, for example, in West Africa, where you have a substantial number of indigenous scripts that have been created, such as the Adlam script you talk about. But there is such a strong tradition that says, if you are going to be an educated person, usually an educated man, then you need to be educated in French or in particular Arabic. In many of the Islamic cultures, education of women is actually not included. So what you have then is a colonial set of thinking that exists even in a post-colonial world, because even if the country has achieved independence, if the belief is that you want to demonstrate that your nation can be a player on the world stage, is worthy of dignity and respect, then there's a very strong temptation to say, and therefore our children should be educated in French or Arabic or English. And I've spoken to people who say, yes, we have such and such an indigenous script or language, but you can't educate people in it, or it can't be used for expressing abstract ideas, all this kind of stuff. And
yes,
of course,
and even there are also many countries with a lot of different peoples in them. And I think the central government feels it as a threat when people identify too much with their own indigenous culture and not with the dominant culture. I think even one of those brothers who developed Adlam was in prison for some time.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. I actually, in my spreadsheet of scripts that were created by an individual, I also have a column in which I talk about what happened to that individual. And we know of at least 4 people who were assassinated for creating a script for their people.
Assassinated?
Yeah.
That's pretty heavy.
Yeah, just for inventing a writing system.
Right, but then that shows what a profound relationship there is between writing as a visual manifestation, not only of a language, but also of a culture. And
cultural identity. Yeah.
That's right. And so there are a number of cultures in the world where their writing system is so important to them visually and culturally and historically that it is still used, even though nobody can read or write it. And I don't mean it's used for everyday purposes, but it might be used on a flag. It might be used on a seal. It might be used on jewelry. It might be used for tourist trinkets. Like the Glagolitic script, it might be used in tourist materials.
Okay, what's that about? Because I saw only one endangered script in Europe, and that was Glagolitic. I never heard about it. That's the one European endangered script. So what is it?
Where is it? In Bulgaria?
Well, it's in several places. So, according to let's say Christian tradition, this may or may not be true. When the first missionaries from the Eastern Church, the Byzantine Church, were about to start spreading the word northward through the Balkans and into Eastern Europe, they created 2 new writing systems, roughly speaking, about 1,000 years ago. One of them was Cyrillic, named after Saint Cyril, who was one of these 2 brothers who to whom these scripts are ascribed, let's say. And the other was Methodius, although that wasn't his birth name. And one of the scripts was Cyrillic, the other was Glagolitic. And the Glagolitic's alphabet, because it is an alphabet, was used as the principal writing system for Old Church Slavonic. And so especially in the Slavic countries and among the Slavic peoples, it was the default Christian alphabet for several centuries. And so it became very closely identified with Slavic nationalism. It became the sort of the flagship script of the Bulgarian Empire. King Boris I of Bulgaria was a great proponent of the Glagolitic alphabet. And in fact, I've created a board game that teaches the Glagolitic alphabet that is set in a monastery in Bulgaria in 1200 AD. Anyway. A board game, yes.
And by doing this game, you learn the alphabet.
Exactly, yes.
Is there an example or a photograph or something online? I can't.
Hang on a second. I can send you images, but hang on a second. I will show you.
Oh, don't worry, we will edit the audio anyhow, so we can. Oh, look at that.
Ah, yeah, there's a picture. There's. Now I see the photograph.
It's a little Tolkien, yes?
No.
No.
No, absolutely not. No, I don't have anything to do with Tolkien because.
Oh, he created some scripts, didn't he?
He did, but
those are
not related to living languages.
Right. So I admire people who can create what are called conscripts or conlangs, but the social purpose is entirely different. So, anyway, so yes,
if there is any.
The Glagolitic alphabet gradually got replaced by Cyrillic. Mm-hmm. Some of the letters, a couple of the letters from Glagolitic were imported into Cyrillic. And of course, the irony there is that Cyrillic, which is a Christian script, was adopted as the flagship script of the godless Soviet Union. Anyhow, so Glagolitic more and more was only used as a liturgical script in monasteries or churches, until eventually, at the end of the 20th century, the last two priests who were in Dalmatia, in Croatia, who had been using the script for their daily purposes, daily liturgical purposes, and thereby influencing local culture, in that if a fisherman bought a new boat, he would get the boat blessed, and the name of the boat would quite likely be written or painted on the side of the boat in the Glagolitic script, because, that therefore is holy. Any event, these two priests ultimately died. And you would think that would mean that the Glagolitic script would now have fallen completely into disuse. But the thing is, it's the only script I know that was saved from extinction by genocide, because shortly after the second of these two priests died, also dies General Tito. And what comes out of that, of course, is the Yugoslav Civil War. And, there's bloodshed and just horrific things happening everywhere. And at the end of it all, you have all of these new nation states, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, all of these new states. And they have to brand themselves, if you like. And that's particularly difficult if they have been recently associated with acts of genocide, and their leader or their former leader is now being is now in The Hague, being held up for crimes against humanity. And so what Croatia did was something really very, very cunning. They started incorporating little bits of Glagolitic in their tourist materials, and therefore gave the impression that all of this recent nonsense, this Civil War stuff, was just, like a flash in the pan, and that they really have this kind of deep roots in history. We were here before all of that. Mm-hmm. And so just literally 2 days ago, I got sent an email from one of these websites that does cheap airfares. And whenever they have a particularly cheap airfare to a particular destination, they write a little bit about that destination. And so apparently they're offering these good deals to Croatia right now. And so in their little profile of Croatia, they mention Glagolitic Alley, which is a kind of a walking sculpture park that you can walk through, and large sculptures in the shape of glagolitic letters are along this walk you can do. And so it's happening. You're seeing the re-emergence of the glagolitic script, which even turns up being sent to me, by email by this airfare company.
Mm-hmm. But I'm kind of wondering, this is in Croatia. Could it ever become more than just like a symbolic statement of identity? Because Croatia it's part of the EU now, I believe. At least it's part of the European community, and they use the Latin alphabet. I don't see the state itself adopting the old alphabet as in their official documentation.
Yes,
paper.
And yet you're absolutely right. It's sort of unlikely, and yet just 5 minutes ago we were talking about the extraordinary fervor that exists, sometimes led by a single person, and certainly often by a small group of people, to revive Breton or Cornish or Manx or Falkirk up in Scotland. All of these very, very, very local languages and sometimes scripts that people feel strongly about. So the answer is, if enough people feel strongly about it, there's no telling what could happen. And what's more, an alphabet or a writing system is easier to revive than a language, because if you lose a language, you no longer know what the internal rules of syntax were. You no longer can hear the tones, for example, if it was a tonal language. And so there's a huge amount that is extremely hard to reconstruct. If you have examples of the characters that were used to speak that language, though, there's very little stopping you from starting to kind of reinvest them with life. And one of the things that I do on the endangeredalphabets.com website is I do monthly profiles of graphic designers and typographers and calligraphers who are experimenting with or exploring or expressing themselves in their traditional minority script, and thereby bringing life back to it and energy back to it. Even if it isn't used for everyday basis, it absolutely could be used for artistic purposes. The Cherokee, for example, have a strong tradition of combining the characters from their syllabary with art. So a small minority of Cherokee actually uses the syllabary, but their respect for the syllabary is strong and growing.
Mm-hmm. So we could have a revival of cuneiform in the south of Iraq. That would be something.
You can get cuneiform fonts and
yes, I know.
All this kind of stuff. It's people's fascination with that as a writing system knows no bounds.
Mm-hmm. But of course, that was the writing system of a very dead language. So,
right. So
they might revive the language too. There have been attempts at reviving old languages. So,
I had a guy from Babelonië in my class, and I used to study Arabic and Babylonian, so I was really fascinating. And he said to us, "Well, where I come from, we don't speak Arabic. We speak." I don't remember what he said. I should contact him to ask him about it, but. I said, yes, so you're from the country of Hammurabi. He said, yes, that's us. So
yes, that's us. I love it.
He identified, he said, what we talk is a mixture of Akkadian, Arabic, and Hebrew. And he spoke some of it, and I recognized indeed some of the tree in it. It was very fascinating, but they don't write it anymore. So.
Right. So this is also very, very strongly connected with cultural identity and also cultural pride. So
Mhm.
I was really fascinated when I was in Egypt. There was a guy there, and I became friends with, who worked in the hotel where I was staying, but was also a tour guide. And he said, we have tremendous respect for the English and the French and the Germans because they taught us our history. They were the archaeologists who came and taught us our history. He said, everything that I know about our history that I tell people as a tour guide, I learned in tour guide school. That is not stuff that we learn in our own school, in our own, educational system. And
Well, we don't learn a lot about Celtic culture either, do we?
No, actually, we don't. And they used to live here in the area, so
absolutely, yes. And this goes back to your observation that there is always this fear of fragmentation.
Mhm.
If we give respect to and recognize too many subcultures, then everything will fall apart.
Well,
And
it's not very practical, of course, but well, practical shouldn't be the main guideline of life, isn't it?
And it also, interestingly enough, ties in with the political system. So if, for example, you have a predominantly two-party system rather than a system of proportional representation, then you're going to be fighting to get all of those minorities into one or the other of those two parties.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And language is a very strong identification factor.
Right. So shall I tell you about the current game project that we're involved in? Because that fits absolutely into our conversation right now.
okay,
Again,
go ahead.
To finish with. Great.
Again.
Okay. So I've been fascinated now for 2 or 3 years by Mongolian calligraphy. So the Mongolian calligraphy is a vertical script. It's influenced by Chinese in the sense that it uses, a brush. It has the same sense of drama and movement in it, and it's endangered. There are the number of practicing calligraphers has been getting smaller and smaller, and it's one of the UNESCO cultural heritage in urgent need of preservation. Right?
And is it an alphabet or a syllabary or?
It is a very strange writing system in that it's an alphabet that behaves like a syllabary. So the units that people think and write in tend to be syllabic, even though there is in fact an alphabetic basis to it. Anyway, so last August, I heard, as did many people, that the Chinese government had announced that the schools in southern Mongolia, which in China is called Inner Mongolia, were going to start teaching Chinese instead of Mongolian.
Yes, we mentioned that in our program, didn't we?
Yeah, a couple of months ago.
Right.
It was in the news.
Yes. And so the Mongolian script is in a very, very interesting and precarious position in 3 separate countries. So there are many Mongols living in Russia, for example, in Buryatia, but their culture has been so overrun by Russian culture that not only do they write in Cyrillic, but many of them don't speak Mongolian, even though they identify as, with Mongolian culture and history. Then you've got the country of Mongolia, which up until roughly speaking the Second World War used this vertical Bichig script, it's called. But when it fell under Soviet influence, they superimposed the Cyrillic script. And so you have them speaking Mongolian, but writing in Cyrillic. And just recently, the Mongolian government said, right, we're going to reintroduce the vertical Bichig script, our traditional script. And they're going to have difficulty doing it because most of the population have never used it. And then in China, you've got a situation where, ironically, that's where traditional Mongol culture has been protected from the influence of the Soviets. And that's where Mongolian calligraphy has flourished and the Mongolian language has flourished. But now the Chinese are threatening to deal with the Mongolians the way that they tend to deal with minorities in general, which is to say, you can be a tourist attraction, but you cause any trouble and we'll go in there and flatten you. So I decided that I wanted to do something about this, because this is a perfect example of what the Endangered Alphabets is all about. It's the relationship between culture, history, tradition, language, and script. And so I was speaking to a number of people on what I call my team, which is basically volunteers and interested parties all over the world whom I talk to on a regular basis, one of whom is Polish, and who spent part of his, not only has he actually been to Mongolia as a child and teaches Chinese, but he spent much of his all of his childhood and young adulthood under communism in Poland. And so he said, you don't want to do anything that is going to upset the Chinese, because that's just going to get people in more danger than they were in before. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is to find a way to enable the Mongolians in southern Mongolia to retain their sense of their identity and their value and their tradition until the totalitarian hand on their shoulder goes away. And of course, as Pole, he understands exactly what this is all about. And he said, I think you should create a game. And so we created a tabletop game. And it involves travel in a nomadic seasonal fashion around sacred sites in the Mongol lands, and trying to gain valuable assets to restore different aspects of Mongolian culture. And in the same way that in the Greek mythology, the gods were always quarreling, but they did it on the human chessboard, if you like. Mm-hmm. Then here you have different Mongolian gods who want a different vision of what the Mongol territory and lands should be like. And those different visions are played out in the game. And the game is called Ulus, which means land or nation, and has a very deep sense of the Mongol connection to the land. And so instead of dice, we're using shagai, which are sheep's knuckle bones, which are used in traditional children's games, but also in divination throughout Asia. And instead of a board, we're using a circular game mat. So this is being actually made for us right now in Mongolia. It's being hand sewn. And the reason we have this game mat is that that's actually what they use. And it has a drawstring around it so that when you finish the game, you just put all of the game elements on the mat and you pull the drawstring and you can hang it up on a hook, or you can put it over the pommel of your saddle as you're going to move off nomadically onto your next place. So it has all of these wonderfully indigenous elements about it. It's unlike any other game, I'm sure, in many respects. And the aim is that it will hopefully introduce people in the West to Mongol culture, which we don't know anything about. And in fact, the Mongols are typically still portrayed as the terrifying horse riders of Genghis Khan, who overran much of Europe nearly 900 years ago, right?
So it sounds like a nice game to take along on a horse track.
Yes, exactly. And you can, with a board game, you would have great difficulty. You'd have to how are you going to keep it level? But this, you can play on the ground. You can play it, anywhere. And so the idea also is that we're going to do a version of it in Cyrillic so that it can be used as a teaching tool in Mongolia to reintroduce all these principles of Mongol culture and the basics of the Mongolian writing system. And then maybe it'll also make its way into Inner Mongolia, and it will serve as a means of keeping Mongol culture alive in people's minds and memories, even despite the efforts of the the Chinese to rewrite their history and to undermine their sense of themselves.
Okay, Kevin, you see what I see?
We're over 1 hour.
We have more than 1 hour, and it will be very hard to cut this down to 1 hour, because I think we've been talking about a lot of interesting things. I wouldn't know what to cut. No,
I think we should indeed wrap it up.
I hope you enjoyed it.
I absolutely did. And again, I'm super grateful to you for having me on the show and for knowing what you're talking about and, asking really good questions as a result.
Well,
we are both linguists, so we have a background. But thank you anyway for
your time.
Willing to spend this time with us.